I'd like to call this special call virtual session to order. If we could begin with the invocation, which will just be a moment of silence. Thank you very much, and if you could please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. We'll have roll call, please.
Good morning. Vieira.
Here.
Goods.
Here.
Kingfelder.
Here.
Carlson.
Here.
Citro.
Here.
Miranda.
Here.
Maniscalco.
Here. All right, before we go to public comment, Mr. Shelby, you have the statement for this special call session during the state of emergency that you'd like to read?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and good morning, City Council. Martin Shelby, the City Council Attorney. As the Chairman did state, this morning's virtual special call meeting is being held during the COVID-19 state of emergency in accordance with Governor Santis's Executive Order 20-69, extended by EO 20-123, and by City Council Resolution 2020-225, which established emergency rules of procedure for the conduct of meetings such as this using communications media technology. Links to both documents are available on the City Council's webpage at tampagov.net/city-council, along with a link to instructions for public comment. And those instructions are also contained within the agenda, which is also available through the link on the city's webpage. And that concludes my comments, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, do we have any public comment?
Good morning, Chair. We do not have any public comments this morning.
All right, thank you. We have one item on the agenda, which is the multi-part presentation, which you should all have in front of you. It was sent out. This is the FY 2020 mid-year review, along with update on PIPES funding and other items, as well as COVID-19 issues. Please reserve all comments and questions till the end of the presentation so we can move through this as quickly as possible. If staff would like to begin with the presentation, you can go ahead now.
Good morning, Chairman. It's John Bennett, Chief of Staff. Thank you for taking time out this morning as a council to go through this agenda, typically as a special session. I just have three quick opening comments, three things to watch for, and then one suggestion before I turn it over to our Chief Financial Officer and the Budget Office. First, I'd like to point out that our Mayor Castor's strong leadership towards fiscal and financial sustainability with council support in FY20 has helped us to be financially resilient leading into COVID-19. You know, the Mayor also reminds us that we are nearing the end of the beginning and not the beginning of the end. But we do have a plan for hope as we transform Tampa's tomorrow. And then lastly, the Mayor has been vetting our budgetary risks on a daily basis, and not only has she kept the day-to-day and the state of emergency protective actions in place, she is also, through council support, in the process of making intelligent financial moves which will provide us sustainability into the foreseeable future to manage those stressors that make our city great. Three things to watch for through the presentation this morning is my suggestion. How starting out FY20 in a conservative manner has kept us resilient into the COVID-19 emergency. Secondly, how the reserve status has given us a great foundation to sustain our key assets, our employees, to continue to provide that level of service to meet the mission, vision, and values of the city of Tampa. And then lastly, in the presentation on the PIPES plan, please look forward to how it's presented through the Budget Office as well as Ms. Duncan's section as it relates to the equal business opportunity, which is supervised by Osea Wynn and her staff. And then my last suggestion is, as we go through the slides, please keep track of the slide numbers if you'd like to go back to those for any questions at the end, since all the questions will be held till the end of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the Chief Financial Officer and the Budget Office, Dennis Ruggiero.
Thank you, Chief. Good morning, Council. Good morning, everyone. This is Dennis Ruggiero, the Chief Financial Officer. Thank you again for having me and staff here this morning for our fiscal year 2020 mid-year review. You know, obviously, there remains a great deal of uncertainty for the city of Tampa and other localities. But despite this, as you heard the Chief say, we're going to keep focusing on a few tried and true principles, maintaining our solid fiscal resiliency with our strong savings and reserves, and keeping with the conservative financial management that the city is known for. We think this is going to allow us to both keep the city government providing day-to-day services during the emergency and help us be in a better position to bounce back quickly when this is over, continuing with our T3 program, our PIPES program, and economic development. Next slide, please. You see on screen the agenda. And of course, this review is going to be a bit different from previous years for obvious reasons. But we will discuss some of the highlights of the current fiscal year prior to the crisis and how our previous decisions have put us on a very sound footing to tackle the financial challenges ahead. Then you see we'll discuss the financial risks associated with the emergency and how, via the One Tampa program, how the city's been aggressive in providing our residents and businesses with support and assistance. From there, we'll give a brief overview of the financial picture for the approximately $3 billion PIPES program. We're continuing forward progress on that with both planning and financing. We're not stopping on that. And finally, we'd like to give you all an opportunity to ask questions, share your concerns, and give us some insight into your priorities for the upcoming fiscal year 2021 budget. Next slide, please. Thank you. We'll begin with the current fiscal year. Of course, as a brief refresher, here's the total of the budget you adopted back in September. Again, just over $1 billion, with the primary components being the ones we talk most often about, the general fund and the enterprise fund, which together make up over 3/4 of the entire budget. Next slide, please. And here are the primary expenditure categories for each of those funds, with the public safety, parks and recreation, economic development, and support operations making up the bulk of the general fund, and the utility departments comprising the enterprise funds you see there. A note on expenditures, you know, the mayor continues to closely scrutinize expenditures, emphasizing what is critical, as we said, for operations, especially parks and recreation, public safety, and public works. Next slide, please. Here are the expenditure, I apologize, got ahead of myself there. And here we show you, as we discussed before, the impact of the transfer to the community redevelopment agencies on property tax revenues and how the costs of police and fire alone eclipse what we receive in property taxes. You know, I show this because the bottom line is, while the general fund is the money the mayor has the most flexibility in spending, it's also our most burdened revenue because it has so many demands placed upon it. Next slide, please. Council, you'll recall that some of our proudest moments early in the fiscal year were the agreements with the collective bargaining units on 3-year contracts for each one, and for police and fire, a healthcare trust all their own. You know, as you know, both of these entailed a great deal of discussion, research, and negotiation. Wanted to highlight that fiscal year 20 started out very, very well in terms of us getting to where we wanted to go in terms of our goals. Next slide, please. Council, you'll also recall undoubtedly the discussion regarding an overarching citywide parks master plan as part of the fiscal year 20 process. And you see here the department anticipates a draft in the near future for the mayor's review and potential consideration of the plan in its entirety later in this fiscal year. Next slide, please. Another highlight you see here, again, as we continue to emphasize a broad-based and consistent perspective, we developed for the first time a cohesive grant planning and submission program citywide, wherein we are pursuing together nearly 50 grants, you see here totaling nearly $80 million. The advantage of this approach is that we can selectively pool our resources for additional funding that meets our short and long-term goals, as opposed to different departments and different agencies pursuing different funding sources. We anticipate that's going to pay off very well going forward. Next slide, please. So we've had some victories, and I show this slide that you've seen before to remind you and the viewing public the strong financial position the city was and remains in as we talk next about the COVID risk. You know, I'm not saying there's not going to be challenges. The city of Tampa, like everyone else, you know, will overcome the challenges this year and next, but no one's going to be immune to the impacts of record unemployment. You know, that means people being unable to pay their bills, including city bills, reduced consumer spending. That's sales taxes we simply won't be getting, the state won't be getting. You've already heard and read about the across-the-board event cancellations. That's tourism money that we rely on that we're not going to get. And of course, undoubtedly, you've heard and read about the roller coaster stock markets. Next slide, please. And now on to the COVID fiscal risk. You see here our guiding principles as we've gone forward trying to meet this challenge. And they're short and to the point, so I'm going to read them out. Protecting the public. Obviously, that is always paramount from the city and the mayor's perspective. Protecting our employees and our city assets. Again, absolutely paramount as we go forward meeting this challenge. Reducing expenditures to support critical core functions that I've discussed, parks and recreation, public works, public safety, and again, maintaining that strong fund balance. Those savings accounts that are going to allow us to weather this storm. Next slide, please. Helping us meet the challenges we're going to talk about are a series of current and potential assistance from the federal, state, and county governments, including FEMA. You know, most of us are familiar with FEMA, and the city has had a very successful history with that organization getting reimbursement for our expenditures. But we've also got some new funding sources to take advantage of that I'm sure you've heard and read about. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. But for right now, I want you to know the mayor's legislative team continues to work very hard with our state and federal representatives pursuing funding for revenue recovery. You know, we're pretty confident that much of our expenditures are going to be recovered through these funding sources, but right now there's no tried and true source for revenue recovery. And as you'll see, revenue reductions are going to be significant. Next slide, please. And here it is. You see this fiscal year, we anticipate we're going to lose nearly $23 million in revenue. And not just any revenue, but primarily some of our most valuable revenues, the general fund and the community investment tax. We'll get into a little more detail in a moment. On the expenditure side, you see the city has already spent nearly $12 million, and with more to come. We've given you a comparison of expenditures for Hurricane Irma just to give you some context as to the scope of what we anticipate our expenditures will be. Next slide, please. And here you see the detail of our major revenue losses. From nearly $6 million at the convention center, again, that's nearly half their revenue gone, to nearly $1 million in state revenue sharing. Council undoubtedly recalls that typically the convention center is a profit center for the city, contributing around $3 million to the general fund last year. That is obviously not going to happen this year. That hurts. Next slide, please. And at the top of the list, you see our community investment tax. 20% or about 1/5 that we're not going to get. You know, this is a very valuable revenue source for us. We use it for vehicles, parking projects. And again, this is a result of consumers not spending money and it not making it into the economy. And then down below, of course, this should not come as a surprise if you've read or heard about what's happening in the oil market. Not only are prices low, which is great, but nobody's buying fuel. So our revenues from a fuel tax perspective are also going down. Next slide, please. Moving on to expenditures associated with this emergency, you see the detail of how the city has pulled out all the stops for both protection and creating a buffer for our residents and businesses. As you see here, again, from various bulk supplies to sanitizing and disinfecting, to getting many of our employees off-site for their protection, ensuring our construction sites are safe. And next slide, please. At the top of the screen, all the way to helping our homeless population, leave associated with the COVID emergency, the use of overtime to respond to this emergency, and then again, you see over $8 million for individual and business assistance. Basically, this has been an accelerated and in large part from scratch army of employees in concert with our community partners, the state, and other localities in response to this. Again, to the tune of nearly $12 million, and that's only going to increase. Next slide, please. The bottom line from a fiscal year 20 perspective is that we're going to go from a position of being well ahead of the game, as you see here in the adopted budget column. When all was said and done, we anticipated we'd have over $6.5 million in additional funding to put in part towards our fund balance, our city savings account. Well, we've gone from that to, over on the right, a loss of almost $8 million in our savings account. That's over a $14 million swing. That's a big impact. As you see at the bottom of the screen, also in the adopted budget, we thought we'd end with a 24% fund balance. You've heard us talk many times about our desired percentage for a fund balance, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, to just over 21%. When you're talking that much money, 3%, that's a big swing. Next slide, please. As I said, here's our fund balance graphic. You can see from the red line that the good news is we continue to exceed our policy of 20%. But as we've discussed in the past, because we've been so successful in maintaining our fund balance, we're concerned about a decrease. Not only are we concerned about a decrease from a security perspective, from a savings account perspective in the face of this uncertainty, but also, as we discussed before, from a credit ratings perspective. The experts, from what I've read, anticipate going forward, there will be a great deal of scrutiny by the credit agencies on everybody's finances, similar to what followed the Great Recession. A drop in our fund balance, our general fund balance, concerns us. And we'll talk more about that also. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? Well, for starters, we're cutting the current year budget over $12 million. As you see here, we're freezing positions, eliminating a few positions, deferring some major purchases, and restructuring some of our debt. I do think it's important to note that although it's going to help our bottom line, we're not eliminating the two positions you see here out of necessity. We're in not that bad a shape. They're two vacant attorney positions that are being eliminated from an efficiency perspective as opposed to a necessity. It's going to help us, but we're not doing it because we just need the money. It's an efficiency thing. And I'll speak a little more in just a bit about why we don't feel the need to furlough or lay off employees. Next slide, please. I'll share with you a little bit of good news and bring us back to revenues for a moment. And you see here property taxes, our largest single source of city revenue, will actually be a bit more than we budgeted this year. And that's great news, but as we've talked before, adverse impacts to property taxes typically lag due to valuations and collection schedules. So this is great news right now. We're going to be paying very close attention over the next 2 fiscal years. you see from the graph that this is the 7th year in a row property taxes have gone up, again, contributing to our very stable financial outlook. Next slide, please. On the unfortunate side, you see electric franchise fees will be brought to their lowest level we anticipate in 8 years. Next slide. Our half-cent sales tax revenues we anticipate will be back to 2017 levels. Next slide. And these two revenues are electric utility services tax and communication services tax. The electric utility services tax will be back to fiscal year 16 levels, and the communication services tax continues its downward trek to its lowest level in over a decade. Next slide. Thank you. Moving to one of the city's biggest expenditures, because let's face it, nothing gets done without people. And again, a little bit of good news. Our personnel costs are anticipated to come in millions less due to some of the actions we're taking now, the hiring freezes, everybody scrutinizing their expenditures. So that's going to help, but it's a great deal of expense funding. Next slide, please. Speaking of personnel costs, and the city's complement of employees, you've seen this slide before, and over the last 10 years, the city's ratio of employees to citizens we serve has continued to decrease. We're the green bar in those years. It's decreased to the point where we're tied with St. Petersburg for the lowest ratio. And as I said earlier, that's one of the reasons we don't feel that we'll need to furlough or lay off employees. Essentially, the city has stayed right-sized, and frankly, in some areas, a bit under-resourced since recovery from the Great Recession. Again, part of the continuing conservative fiscal management that has really become our hallmark. Next slide, please. I'll take a quick moment now to talk about our pension programs. I'm certain you've read and heard a great deal about state and local pension liabilities in this global emergency, and the, frankly, average to terrible shape some pension programs are in. Well, that's not us. We're very fortunate, and you'll notice I didn't say lucky, but we're fortunate to have some of the most solidly funded pension programs in the country. And that's good fiscal stewardship, and that's continuing through the years with our pension obligations. You see here the Fire and Police Pension Program has a relatively stable contribution amount and is funded in excess of 95%. That is an absolutely outstanding percentage. Next slide, please. The General Employees Pension Program has been a bit less stable in terms of contributions, but again, keeping our obligations going, whether it's good times or bad times, has resulted in this fund also being funded to a level of nearly 95%. Again, an outstanding level for both our pension programs. Next slide, please. Moving on to our enterprise funds, you see here that the parking department is going from an anticipated bad year to an anticipated worse year. Over on the right there, the $6.5 million decrease in funding, in their fund balance will pretty much deplete their fund balance of over $7 million. We'll have to address this either through cuts and or a supplement from the general fund, which, as I've already shared with you, and we'll talk more, is already burdened, or a revenue increase from another source. Next slide, please. Your solid waste fund will have a better year than anticipated, primarily due to expenses associated with the McKay Bay transfer, our waste to energy facility, being less than projected. Now that's a good thing, but you see over on the right bottom, they're still going to eat into their fund balance to the tune of over $10 million, but it's better than we thought. Next slide, please. The wastewater department will finish ahead, but less ahead than anticipated. They remain in very sound financial shape. Next slide, please. And the water department will finish well ahead, better than anticipated, primarily due to purchasing less water from Tampa Bay Water than we anticipated. Next slide, please. Wanted to speak a little bit about the city's healthcare program. Of course, this is a worldwide health emergency. You can see some of the steps we've taken to relieve the burden for our employees. Bullet number 3, unsurprisingly, our healthcare consultant has placed our risk factor above average. Again, not surprising. We've got a lot of first responder and frontline employees out there. So far, the conservative estimate for how it's going to impact this fiscal year is about $750,000, and we'll continue keeping our eye on that. There may be other areas that offset this, and we'll let you know when and if that happens. Next slide, please. Thank you, Council. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Carol Post, our Administrator for Development and Economic Opportunity. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Previous slide, please. There you go. To talk about, as you see here, our One Tampa Relief Fund. Ms. Post?
Good morning. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, City Council members, Chair, and members of the public. I'm pleased to be here this morning and provide a report on our One Tampa Relief Fund. I know there's a lot to cover, so I will just jump right in. Next slide, please. I wanted to be able to provide a little bit of refresher background to ensure that folks, if they are not familiar, particularly from the public perspective, just to reset what the program is and where it stands now. A reminder that the One Tampa Relief Fund was developed to be a quick undertaking that the city could do to provide relief to its most vulnerable individuals and small businesses. And on suggestion from, in fact, the members of our CRA board, we positioned this to be grant relief versus a loan, so it is not necessary to be repaid, and it is directly paid to recipients of rent, mortgage, and utility payment on behalf of the relief recipient. And the idea behind it was, again, to be a very fast reactive assistance to individuals and small businesses that would be incurring losses or inability to pay some of their most essential bills while they were awaiting some of the state and federal funds to come through. And this was done relatively quickly, and at the time that we were doing it, it was largely reliant on the use of CDBG federal funds, which had many limiting restrictions, and I'll cover that in a little more detail. But those limitations to some part reflect in our preliminary outputs, which I'll report on today. Next slide. The nature of the relief was geared toward what we thought were the most basic needs of individuals and small businesses to ensure that they could preserve basically shelter. So it was to pay a rent, mortgage, or lease payment, and a utility, and you see the values here, up to $1,000 for rent or mortgage for an individual or family, and up to $250 for utilities, and for small businesses up to $4,000 for rent or mortgage and $1,000 for utilities. In both cases, based on our projected budget, we had a target of the number of individuals or small businesses that we wanted to try to ensure could benefit from the relief. On the individual side, it was 2,500, and on the small business side, it was 800. Next slide. I'll focus first on the individual program, just to give a little, again, a reminder of the process that we undertook. And in the blue box, a refresher of what the eligibility criteria was. And again, most of those points were tied to CDBG requirements for the use of those federal funds. We started the application process on a Friday afternoon, April 17th, with the target to have up to 2,500 individual recipients. By Saturday, late Saturday afternoon, we had received just slightly over the 2,500 target. So we closed the application process. At that time, there were about 6,000, more than 6,000 participants or individuals that had attempted to initiate the process. When we began the review, as early as that Sunday, we began reviewing applications, and it became apparent that notwithstanding there being some guidance materials and a map tracker, we had almost half of the applicants not actually located in the city limits. So they were immediately deemed to be ineligible, unfortunately. And I'll speak about that in just another moment. As a quick breakdown of the type of relief that was requested, just as FYI, at this point, as we're getting through the process of completing the payouts, we're seeing that the vast majority of applicants are seeking both rent and utilities. A smaller percentage are seeking mortgage and utilities. And then there was a cohort that was seeking only rent, some seeking only mortgage, and some seeking only utilities. So let me just give an update of where we are in serving those applicants. Next slide, please. As I said, out of the 2,500, it turned out that there was just about 1,400 applicants who were located within the city of Tampa and therefore eligible for the relief of those. And so we've begun to process those. We've contacted each of them, and they are in various stages of the application process. As of Friday afternoon, we had made payment out to 665 of them, representing about 48%, so we're almost halfway through making the direct payment out to their landlord, lender, or utility provider. We have about 76 that are ready for payment. We move these in sort of chunks through the process, trying to do about anywhere from 70 to 100 each payment cycle to make our way through it. So we still have about 650 that are waiting for final approval. In many cases, we're actually waiting on documentation from them or from their landlord or lender to ensure that we can finalize the process. At this point, we have paid out $623,000 on behalf of the individual relief. And as you can see, we're running somewhat below budget, which is a positive thing, that we've been able to assist these individuals below the cap max, which was $1,250 per individual. I would comment on this that part of our process has been a partnership with the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay. We partnered with Crisis Center of Tampa Bay because they already had the mechanics in place to make these kinds of direct payments out to lenders and landlords and utilities, and that's been quite helpful for us. We are doing the application process and the review process, but when the funds are ready to be remitted, the Crisis Center has been the conduit for us, and that's been very helpful so that we did not have to reinvent that wheel. That being said, the review process is a manual one. We have a number of technical staff that have to take each individual application, review through the eligibility, and then correspond with either the recipient or with the applicant, and obviously also the recipient, whether it's a landlord, a lender, or in this case, some of the utilities. So it's a tedious process, which is one that's resulted in us being taking some, as I said, as a full process to get through it. But we have had a number of very positive stories. We've had incredible gratitude and reaction from individuals who've received their the payments, and it's quite gratifying to be able to see the process through from start to end. I would indicate, as we said, that in this case, our target was to assist up to 2,500 individuals. This first cohort will be just about 1,400. So our plan for the next step is to return to that applicant pool. As I said, we had, at the time we closed the application process, we still had about 6,000 in the queue. We've already communicated to that group of applicants. A large number of them, again, were not actually residents of the city of Tampa. There are about 2,000 that are eligible as city residents. So we are going to work with them to have them complete their applications, and that should drive us to that 2,500 target. One bit of good news on the side is that shortly after we initiated this individual program, Hillsborough County initiated a similar program. We've been working with them to ensure that we could transfer the non-city resident applicants to the county and have them take advantage of the county's program, which was a very similar program. So we're hoping that not too many of these applicants will get left behind. Let me turn then to the business relief program. Next slide, please. Same thing, I'll just provide a brief update on the process. We rolled this out a week or so after the individual process. We had some lessons learned, particularly that we wanted to have this be a two-step process so that we could pre-screen the applicants and make sure they met some of at least the minimum eligibility requirements, such as their geographical location. So we had a pre-application process that began on April 21st. It concluded on April 22nd. And at that time, we were conducting an almost, almost on-the-spot live pre-app review, so that as applicants were deemed to be preliminarily eligible based on the geographical location, we would then continue them to the next step for completing the full application. That process began on Friday, April 24th. We had 687 small businesses that went through the pre-application process and were pre-screened for geographical location. Of the 687, only 204 were pre-approved to push through to the full application process. And that differential is largely, again, based on businesses that were not located either within the city of Tampa or further within a low-income census tract or a CRA, which was one of the qualifying requirements. Of the 204 that did meet that geographical limitation or constraint, we had only 138 that completed the full application process. For the balance, we had our care advisors emailing, telephoning. There was a substantial amount of exchange that went back and forth, really trying to assist these businesses to be able to provide and complete the full application, but some of them just simply didn't qualify. So we ended up with 138 completed applications. And again, that's on a preliminary basis for that geographical set point. Once we started to engage with the 138 in terms of obtaining more substantial documentation around the revenue for their businesses, the tax returns relative to their losses, which was another qualifying criteria, and the number of employees, which was a CDBG required criteria. It resulted in 90 of those 138 not meeting the full eligibility criteria, and largely some of that being CDBG requirements. So ultimately, we are now working with 50, just slightly more than 50 business applicants who have fully met the eligibility criteria and are in the process for payment. About half of those have actually received the payment and are completed through the process, and the rest are continuing as we speak. On this process, we partnered with the Tampa Bay Black Business Investment Corporation. They've been an incredible assistance to us to conduct the review and basically the underwriting process, particularly around review of tax returns and business-related financial documentation. So without question, we have more work to do here ahead of us, and that's what we have on our very near-term horizon. So next slide, please. Our plan now is to turn and revisit the business relief piece of this. We feel like we have a plan on the individual side to meet our target in a pretty compact way, but on the business relief side, we are seeking to revisit this and revisit the criteria and eligibility, particularly now that we have the benefit of and the generous contribution of our CRA to help expand the footprint as well as the eligibility standards. So our plan is to remain focused on those of the most vulnerable of our business community that might otherwise fall through the cracks. So we will we will maintain the low-income census tract and the CRA geographical limitations. And we'd like to remain focused on providing support for rent, mortgage, and utilities. We feel that those are the essential needs that any business, if you can't pay to keep the business roof over your head, what else, you know, there is probably no other point. So we feel like we want to be the safety net for that most essential element. But we're very much seeking to expand the criteria and expand the benefit itself. The lessons that we learned from that first round, a couple of key things. One, the two most limiting factors that resulted in a business not meeting eligibility criteria. The first was the number of employees. That was a CDBG requirement that required a business to not have more than 5 employees. We found that that knocked out many businesses, unfortunately, and so we're actually eliminating that requirement entirely. The other was the requirement that a business established that it had lost at least 50% of revenue as a direct result of the COVID pandemic. And this was just a very difficult item to mark. Not only was it difficult to establish that point, but there was a substantial amount of documentation back and forth, which made it onerous on the business as well as ourselves and dragged the process out longer than any of us would like. So we're eliminating that as well. So we're going to expand the criteria, we're going to simplify the documentation requirements, and we're also going to streamline the review process. So next slide, please. This will be the new expanded eligibility standards for round 2, if you will. We'd like to reduce the time in business requirement, which had been already reduced to 2 years. We'd like to reduce it 1 more year so that the business need only have been in business for 1 year from prior to February 1st. As I said, we've completely eliminated the number of employees maximum criteria. Doesn't matter how many employees any business has, that will not be a criteria to be reviewed. We're also eliminating the requirement to document reduced revenue. Our rationale here is that because we are maintaining the fact that the business must be one of the critically impacted businesses, which are those that were either ordered to be closed by order of the governor or otherwise de facto are closed because of the inability to normally conduct business. And we have that list outlined on our website. Our rationale was that if you are one of these critically impacted businesses, or if you were definitively closed by order of the governor, then you suffered substantial losses, and we did not need to go through the process of filing tax returns and so on to establish that proof. So we've just eliminated that. We also have increased the business
That's probably the most critical part. Mr. Shelby, you have an opinion on that?
Well, the slides have been available. The slides, I believe, are posted to the CTTV Live webpage. They should be there as we speak. They were recently posted, so those people who cannot see the slides should be able to pull them up that way. And again, this is also being recorded. And I don't know how this is going over CTTV. I heard the chair talk about Facebook Live, but I've been participating through the GoToWebinar
Okay.
app, and everything seems to be working properly from what I can see here.
The audio is back on the Facebook Live video because I can hear it, everything you're saying delayed. So, okay, now the slide is back on with slide 43 showing. So I think as long as we have the okay from everyone else, we should be back in business.
Mr. Chair, I see it on the television as well.
Okay.
Mr. Bennett, are you okay with that, Mr. Bennett?
Yes, we're ready to start.
Okay, go ahead and take it away from this this slide here showing round 2 and where Ms. Post had left off.
Okay, we are ready to go. At the risk of anyone breaking into song, I will reconvene.
Yep.
Thank you. And this is actually my last slide, and highlighting the fact that as well as expanding eligibility, we expanded the benefits. I think I made the reference to business owners that we felt like we were unable to fully help because of the way we had structured the program. Many great lessons learned on our part. And so the way this round 2 will work is that the business will be able to avail themselves of up to $4,000 for all rent, lease, or mortgage payments that they may either be in arrears on or for the next month available. So our desire is to exhaust those funds to help each business get to a sort of a state of good standing for their rent or lease. Likewise with utilities, we're expanding the benefit both to be for multiple months if a business ended up in more arrears than just one, and also to expand beyond essential utilities, which were electric, gas, and water. We also are now including Wi-Fi and internet providers and other essential business services that would be eligible for that utility payment. So we are really eager to ensure that we can reach that goal of 800 businesses being served by this expanded benefit. We are, so the last piece of this is that we will streamline the application and the review process and make it an ongoing rolling process, starting with a pre-qualification that will run for 1 week. And the idea is that as soon as applications start coming in, our teams and the Tampa Bay Black Business Investment Corporation team will begin the underwriting and the review immediately. There will be less documentation required, so that will be a helpful step. And as soon as a business is deemed eligible, it moves on to the payment cycle. If it is unfortunately deemed ineligible, we'll be able to do that right out of the gate so that we can keep that application process until we have 800 eligible applicants. So with that, I will pause on the programmatic side and turn over for one quick update on financial and budget side of the program to our CFO, Ms. Rogero.
Mr. O'Hare, before you begin, if I could ask everyone to mute your phones. There's some background noise here that's causing interruption. All right. Thank you, Mr. O'Hare, if you'd like to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Dennis Rogero again. Just wanted to give a brief overview of the financing structure associated with the relief program. You see here before you in that first column, the general revenues, the $2 million, and you'll recall that originates with our emergency reserve. I'll point out that $350,000 you see as a loan was the immediate upfront payment to the 211 Crisis Center, so they could start, well, immediately to pay individuals' bills, and we wouldn't have to wait for a transition of funding. We will get that back. In total, about $2 million from our reserves. You can see in the second column, our donations either received or pledged to date are almost $1.3 million. Very, very pleased with that. We've discussed before the Community Development Block Grant funding and the CRA interest funding. And as we said earlier in the presentation, over $8.5 million towards this effort. Just a great program, built fast and built lean. Next slide, please. And that will conclude this portion of the presentation regarding the One Tampa Relief Program. And we'll move on. Next slide, please. To a programmatic financial update for the PIPES program. I'm going to turn it over to our budget officer, Mike Perry, to walk you through that. Mr. Perry?
Thank you, Dennis. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, last September, Tampa City Council approved a 20-year water and wastewater rate plan in order to support a $2.9 billion 20-year capital improvement program. Those rates went into effect on November 1st, 2020. One of the first events or activities we did following the activation was to request Tampa City Council to authorize a reimbursement resolution. What a reimbursement resolution authorizes staff to do is to start awarding contracts based on a pending debt issuance. So we have issued contracts, again, pending those bond proceeds that we hope to issue sometime this summer. On the slide on page 47, you see that we have awarded close to $52 million under 5 contracts for design and or construction work. And so these projects are currently underway. Next slide. I'm sorry. Yeah, next slide. Slide 48. The city has selected these 3 firms totaling $750 million worth of projects through the CCNA process. And we're currently in negotiations with these 3 firms on the initial guaranteed maximum price, primarily for the design component of the work being assigned. Next slide. And then we have 3 projects totaling about $39 million that we are on hold pending CCNA until the COVID-19 incident is mitigated and we can start holding the CCNA selection process, maintaining social distancing. Overall, PIPES projects amount equals $850 million of projects awarded of the $2.9 billion within the 20-year program. With that, that concludes the PIPES update.
Thank you, Mike. This is Dennis again, Mr. Chair. Just a final note on the PIPES program. Again, you heard the scale of this project. It's going to be a number of different debt issuances, and to that aim, we have not stopped behind the scenes. We have selected our team for the first issuance, which we estimate is going to be about $200 million. So behind the scenes, and we're continuing to pursue that debt issuance, and as you heard from Mike, we hope to effect that sometime summer. Next slide, please. And finally, in the formal portion of the presentation, Council, you see what the milestones that we'll be pursuing over the next couple of months. As you're aware, we've got some workshops the end of this month and next month. The mayor's budget presentation to Council is anticipated for August 6th. We'll have an additional workshop in August, and then the public hearings in September. Next slide, please. Thank you, Council. And again, this concludes the formal portion of the presentation. Again, we set aside time to give you all an opportunity to ask questions about this presentation and also provide us with some guidance as to your priorities and what you're thinking as we continue with the fiscal year 2021 budget process. So, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. O'Hara, for that presentation and everybody else involved. I will go to council members for questions or comments, and I'll just go down the line. We'll start with Council Member Dingfelder. Councilman Dingfelder.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got quite a few questions, so if I could ask, Mr. Chairman, would you defer me toward the end or at the end, so that way hopefully
Okay.
other council members take my
All right.
questions. Thank you.
Councilmember Goods.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your leadership today. I guess me looking at the slide, my biggest concern right now is the one Tampa, as you know. I still feel strongly. I know a bunch of the council members were out this weekend talking to a lot of business owners, partaking in some of their foods and drinks and so forth. And as they discussed about some who have been under the gun, who've been in business, maybe 11 months, maybe 6 months that have been affected, but we're still holding the throat, our foot on their throat with the 1 year. And I just wish that would go away. I don't really see the need for that. It makes no difference if I was doing well when the COVID started and I got shut down. I don't feel I should be punished. I feel I should be able to be a part of the process because it was a pandemic that started and everybody was affected. So I should be a part of that process. So I just don't understand the reason for the 1 year. It just doesn't sit well with me. And I just want to hear from Ms. Post again. And I'd like to hear from other council members if they weigh in on this, what they feel about this is.
Ms. Post, if you'd like to address that question by Councilmember Goods.
Sure, I'm happy to, and I appreciate it. Councilman Goods and I have talked about this point, and I certainly appreciate his perspective 100%. In an ideal world, we would be happy to try to help every business out there, regardless of any criteria. As we know, there are a series of constraints that are tied to the use of some of these funds. But in this case, I think our rationale is more about the nature of where we originally started was to help businesses that, but for the COVID pandemic, would have been thriving and had demonstrated performance around their viability. And not to say that a new business that's been around 6 months or 4 months or 11 months isn't viable, but they will have a much more challenging time seeing their way through this than an established, long-standing business. And I think our sense was to be able to be as prudent with the limited funds as we could to help a business that is more likely than not to see this through the support of this small contribution versus a business that may still be challenged and may not actually make it through to a full long-term solution.
And again, I appreciate your rationale on that. But as I go out this past weekend, I talked to the gelato ice cream owner who's been open and was thriving, still thriving now. And they say she can't get it, or the gentleman in West Tampa who's opened up a craft beer, and he's not eligible because he's right under the window there, and he was doing well and spent a lot of money to try to open this business. So that's really my concern for those folks who are out there working. Their businesses are there, they're in the community, and they're trying to bring economic impact to their area. So that's just my concern, and I just think you just need to look at that, and that's just personally with me. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Councilmember Vieira.
Sorry, getting myself off mute there. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it, sir. Thank you, everybody. Ms. Post, Mr. Rajero, for your remarks and your hard work. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. For me, the budget is it's good for us to begin having a dialogue on the budget. In a regular year, it would be good for us to begin to have a dialogue on the budget at this time, if not earlier, as we've discussed before, but especially now when we're having a dialogue that a lot of local governments are being forced to have. It's frankly, night and day with where we were a few months ago on the budget. We were talking about various capital projects. It was, unemployment hovering at about 4%. And good times prospectively ahead. And then we have this pandemic with just night and day changes with regards to what we're going to be seeing with our budget forecast. A new chapter, frankly, is beginning, I think, in the city of Tampa. And we don't know how long this chapter is going to last. But I think that our budget should reflect this lasting for some time. This is something, again, that a lot of communities are having in terms of a dialogue. It's really frustrating for neighborhoods, and we have to acknowledge that frustration because, you know, this was the year, and these were the years when neighborhoods were going to look towards having local government's attention in our neighborhoods. We saw it here in the city of Tampa beginning to do that in 2017 with investments that we made at Villa Brothers Park, Williams Park, New Tampa Rec Center the year before, the Cascadian Pool through Tampa City Council and working with the city of Tampa. And we were looking to build on that. So that's frustrating. To build on that frustration, again, frustration that I think we have to acknowledge as a body. Just a few months ago, we were looking at not only a decent economy, but potentially one way or another all for transportation money. So we could be at a point where we're not just going to be without those funds, but prospectively, right? But with less than what we were looking at having. It's frustrating, but that's our reality right now. So when I look at this year's budget, you know, to me, this is not going to be a Lyndon Johnson budget. This is going to have to be a Calvin Coolidge budget. You know, meat, potatoes, and a lot of greens to be really, really healthy. We've made tough decisions in the past, and we're going to have to make tough decisions in the near future because of this. To me, there's a couple of principles that we have to adhere to whenever it comes to our budget. Core critical city services have to be protected. We have to protect public safety, and especially, I really want to emphasize this, which is we have to remember those city workers who provide those core critical city services, who have worked so hard throughout COVID-19, putting themselves at risk, being in front of prospectively exposing themselves to COVID-19, doing core critical city services. We have to remember that. And by core critical services, I refer to not only things like keeping our existing parks open, transportation investments, but not losing sight of the core critical services that we provide to those who don't have a voice. You know, there was that book, The Other America, The Other Tampa. To me, these are core critical services that presently exist that we have to protect. So it's a time for restraint, for responsibility, and more than anything for leadership. Nobody likes to do this, but obviously we have to. The numbers don't lie. Nationally, we're looking at unemployment at about 1 in 6, 1 in 7 Americans. And some folks think the number's higher and certainly going to go higher, being formally unemployed. And, you know, we talk about looking to the county, looking to the state, looking to the federal government for long-term help, for short-term help. And, you know, when we look at the fiscal state of the federal government right now, I remind people we began this crisis on the federal level with a budget deficit before COVID-19 of over $1 trillion. That is, before this crisis hit, we were spending $1 trillion more than what we took in. Now that's going to go up to $3-4 trillion with this year's much needed relief packages. So in other words, when we look at the federal government, we don't know what's going to be there. There's an old saying that you're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. And the facts as we see them right now with regards to our budget numbers, our economic numbers, our unemployment numbers, they're very, very harsh economic numbers. So we have to lead, all of us, one by one, as Tampa City Council members, as the administration, to support fiscal responsibility, fiscal restraint, and protection of our core critical services. That's what this time to me is all about. We all had projects and different things like that we wanted to see in this year's budget. Again, a new reality has come upon us, and I know that we're all going to be meeting that challenge of leadership right now. I have faith that all of us will, and that we'll be able to protect our core critical city services. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll move on to Councilman Citro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well said, Councilman Vieira. I just have two quick questions to our budget people, and I hope that we can get some sort of answer. And I know it's hard to predict anything. How long is it expected to recover from this? And I know there cannot be any definite answers, but in that recovery time, do we foresee any type of cuts, whether it be personnel or otherwise? That's question one. And to Councilman Vieira's point on public safety, will this crisis, will the loss of revenue affect our public safety, TPD or fire? Go ahead. If you want to jump in there and answer those questions, I would appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Hello, Mr. Chair, Councilman Citro. This is Dennis Rajero. I'll address the first question first regarding, the length of this emergency and potential future cuts. I mean, it is simply unknown, and I'm sure I'm not sharing anything new with you. But no matter what sources you turn to, no matter what experts you turn to and their advice, the level of uncertainty, and you've heard this description before, is absolutely unprecedented. Now, you've heard some of the steps we're taking in the current year, and based on your input and going forward and the revenue receipts that we'll continue getting and the revenue information we'll continue getting, the actions of both the federal government and the Federal Reserve, and keeping an eye on our expenditures, further to your second point, those critical services, parks and recreation and public safety and public works. Bottom line, we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know the extent of any future cuts yet. That's what we're working on right now. But, with our emphasis on public works, parks and recreation, and public safety, no, we do not foresee any reductions in public safety services. And I wish I could provide you more certain information, but again, predictions are a dime a dozen. What's going to happen is all over the map. So that's the best we can share with you right now.
Mr. Herrera, thank you very much for that. If I may, Mr. Chair, we do realize that there is no certainty in the future. So we as a council and the administration, we both have to work with the people and realize that this is going to be a time of doing with the basic necessities, making sure that the citizens of Tampa get their water, get their fire, get their police, get their solid waste pickup. So I thank you, Mr. Rajero. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to ask these questions.
Thank you very much. Next up, Councilman Miranda.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank everyone involved. I think that in a short period of time, just looked at all the speakers that we had today and the programs that would put up, and all of them have to be adjusted sooner, because when there's other two words that were said here that really caught my ear, known and unknown. In my humble opinion, there is no known. The known becomes after you hit the unknown and you realize what the facts are, then that is the known. And every day, because of the situation within, not only in this country, but in this world, the unknown becomes a real danger and a real factor. When you look at the positions, there was 26 positions that were put on hold to October 1st, and 2 were eliminated, I believe, in the legal department. Everything that's been said is understandable. The administration presented I think, an excellent look into the future. This is not a known future. This is an unknown future. There will have to be further adjustments made, and I'm afraid they're not going to be in our favor. Going back to the PIPE program, the PIPE program was 53% self-funding pay and 47% bonded, if I recall. Of the $846,002,325 that we've already accounted for that we're going to spend on this first go round, is that coming from the pay self or from the bonded part?
Who'd like to answer that question, Mr. Rajero?
Whoever.
Mr. Miranda, this is Mike Perry, the budget officer. Can you restate the question?
Yeah, Mike. The $846 million that we have put on the shelf, on the process of going through forward now with different companies. And by the way, all those have done business with the city in the past, I recall, and they've all done an excellent job. The 53%, is that self-pay? Is this coming, the $846 million out of the self-pay? 53% or out of the 47% that was going to be bonded out towards the end?
The of the $846 million we identified today, approximately $500 million will be debt. Until we get further into the rate increase, we just don't have enough pay-go up front to do pay-go. As we get further into the program and revenues rise, we'll go more into the pay-go. I will say that the markets are looking very favorably as far as interest rates. So if we are ever going to issue debt, now is the time to issue debt.
Okay, and then can you express to us the understanding of, I think we're putting $2 in on wastewater and $2 in on drinking water. Am I correct? A month? Yes,
sir.
Pair?
Right now, sir, the current, I'm sorry. I'll let you complete your question, sir.
No, I'm finished with that question. So what is it that we collect every month on that $2 and $2 or $4 a month? I don't know exactly the answer. That's what I'm asking.
Yes, sir. The new customers are now charged a base fee of $2 per month per ERU, and ERU is equivalent to a residential unit. So their bill consists of a $2 base fee for water, a $2 base fee for wastewater. You have the normal wastewater consumption rate that is mitigated by the sewer cap. And then on the water side, you have the tier rate structure from tier 0 up to tier 4 on the residential side. So it's both a base fee and a consumption fee.
Yeah, but the only money that goes into the pay of debt is that $2 on one side and $2 on the other side, water and wastewater.
No, sir, that's not correct. It's the total revenues coming into the system.
Okay. All right, then I got my answer on the first part, that 500 of it is debt, 500 million, so that leaves 346 million self-pay. Am I correct then?
Generally, sir, that is correct.
Yeah. All right. I appreciate it very much, Mike. I really appreciate all the work you've done in putting all these numbers together. Like always in the past, you've done an outstanding job, and I appreciate you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I'm finished, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Carlson.
I want to echo what my colleague just said. Thank you to all the staff for taking the time to put this together and also for working proactively to get all the numbers together. Just from a philosophical point of view, you all know that one of my concerns was that the kind of reckless spending of the last administration, during the Great Recession, Mayor Arroyo saved about $150 million in the general fund reserved, and that was, I think, just below 100 million when we started. And I was concerned about that because usually you save during the boom times and then you spend during the down times. And in this case, one mayor saved during the bad times, and the other mayor spent during the good times. So when Mayor Castor came to me a year ago and said, are there any projects do you want to spend on? I said, the only thing I want is to put money in the general fund reserve. And thank goodness she and all of you of her staff were in favor of that, and you all had the same idea and goals. And so we put some money away, but we all anticipated that a recession would hit. We didn't realize that it would hit this fast and this hard. And hopefully it will not last very long. One other philosophical statement: I think we ought to shift quickly from this One Tampa program to a longer lasting, more sustainable economic development program. Again, if you talk to any of the economists or look at Tampa scorecard, Tampa's economy was not very diverse, and we had too much poverty and too many other problems. And so we have a chance to remake our economy in a new way, and we've got some drivers working toward that, and the mayor has hired excellent staff to try to address that. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just ask one for time. Mr. O'Hara, have you done some kind of sensitivity test, like the projections you've shown? Is that best guess at the moment? Do you have 20% sensitivity either direction, or what kind of projections do you do to try to figure out what's the likely course?
Thank you, sir. Again, this is Dennis Rajero. Thank you. That's a good question. This is the information that we are most comfortable with right now based on projections. And we're looking at a number of different sources. Of course, we're doing our in-house calculations. We're looking at other localities and talking to other localities, discussing this with our professional associations. And then, of course, seeing what the experts are saying from any number of different financial sources. Again, I can guarantee you only one thing, that these are not correct. Yeah. That they are what we've got the most, but this is what we've got the most confidence in right now. And of course, we will continue and are continuing to refine them literally on a daily basis.
Yeah, similar to my colleague, Councilman Miranda, I have a lot of confidence in you all. The projections that you've been able to show and the numbers you've shown over the last year have been excellent. And so hopefully these are a worst case scenario. One last thing, he also mentioned, Councilman Miranda also mentioned the PIPES program. I'm hopeful that that will be one of the drivers to pull us out of the recession. And it's not something new. We approved it a year ago. And so I would be in favor of moving forward as quickly as possible with any of that and not holding any of it up, because it will bring jobs and money back to our economy. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go back to, and with our final speaker before I'll wrap up, is Councilman Dingfelder. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And of course, thanks to all of our city employees, frontline, as well as everybody who's put together this good presentation. I have a couple, 7 or 8 questions. Everybody can bear with me. Mr. Bennett, if we could do it as a lightning round, I'll just ask the question, get a quick answer, and then I'll move to the next one, if that's okay with Mr. Bennett and Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
All right. In regard to the property tax drops that we might see, has anybody, and this would probably be Dennis, has anybody looked at the comparison of commercial and office versus residential? My gut tells me that residential might hold firm for a while, but commercial and office property values might be dropping precipitously as we look at vacancies. Dennis, has that been part of the evaluation?
It has not, sir, only because, of course, the potential has been, but, the lag on property taxes, whether it's residential or commercial, is so long. If you'll recall from the Great Recession, it took some time for property taxes to feel the impact of that. And it'll take some time for us to see an impact in this go round. So all we can do right now is look at some of the tangential data, mortgage defaults, what's happening in the real estate, both the residential and commercial real estate markets. But it's simply too early to tell to what extent property taxes will be hit.
But going to Mr. Citro's question, in terms of the length of these impacts, some of these impacts might be lagging out a couple of years, especially as related to property tax. All right, next question. In regard to sales tax revenue, and you might have said this, Dennis. What do we have any early results, and what sort of percentage drop are we looking at in sales tax that's coming our way?
Again, no concrete evidence yet. Our general projection is about a 25% decrease. And again, that's based on tangential activity. You're seeing, the drop in gross domestic product. You're seeing the drop in retail spending. Across the economic environment, money is simply not being spent. And if money's not being spent, then it's going to be hit, or it's going to hit the sales tax revenues.
We're still buying a lot of groceries, but we don't have a sales tax on. All right.
Well said.
In regard to the PIPES program, and I don't know if Mr. Perry or who might want to look at this, our utility revenues, I think I was talking to Brad or somebody the other day, it looks like we're already having some initial utility revenue drops, and is that of concern or great concern?
This is Mike Perry. right now, we are not looking at any decrease in utility revenues, mainly because of the method of accounting that we get to accrue and book revenues when the utility bills are used. We only have 1 month of comparison. I think we had the month of March where we compared water coming out of the water plant from 2019 to 2018, and it was comparable. I have to get the updated report for April. But again, we're seeing revenues pretty comparable to where we were last year.
So Mike, let me interrupt you. I guess maybe I don't want to confuse what we're billing versus what we're collecting. Maybe when Brad and I were talking the other day, maybe there's an issue about collections.
That's one of the issues we're the One Tampa program will help us mitigate a bad debt or default positions. So because one of the areas that we're helping assisting people in are the utility bills. So the One Tampa should help the city somewhat mitigate that. But yeah, we'll have to take a look at the bad debt and our aging report as we go through. But as a benchmark, we generally collect about 97 to 99% of whatever we bill. So we'll have to continue looking at that and going in the future.
Councilman, this is Dennis Rajero. I believe Mr. Baird is on the line. Brad, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, this is Brad Baird, Deputy Administrator of Infrastructure. Councilman Dingfelder, I was referring to other utilities are seeing some drop in water and wastewater revenues, and so far we are not seeing that. So so far so good.
Okay, great. I'm sorry I misunderstood. I hope it holds up. In regard to the pension, and Dennis, I think you spoke to the pension. The stock market, I don't follow it very tightly, but I know it's up and down and up and down. But overall, I think it's had pretty significant drops since the first of the year, since March. What sort of impact is that on our pension funds? I know you said we're 95% funded, but down the road, if the stock market continues to drop or lag, we have to make up the difference typically, right? And have we looked at that, and what sort of impact is that going to be on our general fund?
That's a great question, sir. This is Dennis. Yes, we're continuing to review that, both on the GE pension side and the fire and police pension side. We have a tremendous amount of assets invested, about $2 billion on the fire and police pension side, and a little less than $1 billion on the GE pension side. Yes, it will be impacted by the stock market. Although, as you referenced, it's, for lack of a better word, it's a roller coaster right now. Too soon to see what the impact will be. If I'm a betting man, it's going to be negative. But again, too soon to tell, and we'll provide you more detailed information, definitive detailed information when we have it.
Okay. Mr. Bennett, this one's probably more for you because it's a little more political than it is number crunching. We have all read that the county has received or is receiving like $250 million from the feds, and then they in turn decide how they're going to divvy that out. We have significant revenue losses. We have losses all across the board. I know that we're in discussions with the county. How are those discussions going, and do we have any progress?
Thank you, Councilman.
Did you want? Oh.
Yeah, Dennis, I think we could share the response. Councilman Dingfelder, first of all, I've been working with Mr. Merrill, the county administrator, and Dennis will probably share that he's working with Bonnie Wise over there. As we know, we looked at the source of the money and the guidance, and of course it comes from a county-wide perspective, which includes our population. And of course, our staff. Dennis mentioned earlier that our legislative team, Marley Wilkes and Ian Whitney, have been working behind the scenes to understand those guidance and those opportunities to use that money for the challenges that we faced. Dennis has had more intimate discussions with Bonnie Wise around that, and the city administration and staff are working internally to mesh with the county on those requests. Dennis, do you want to augment that a little?
Yes, sir. Thank you. This is Dennis. Yeah, as the chief said, Ms. Wise and I are dialoguing about the particular components of what the CARES Act allows. Of course, I'll remind everybody that under the current guidelines, it doesn't allow for a direct benefit to the city. We have to go through the county. So we want to make sure our response is not only coordinated together to the Treasury Department, because ultimately the county will have to defend the necessity and reasonableness of these expenditures, but also on par with the different particular requirements of the Treasury's guidelines. So it's millions and millions of dollars, of course. You know, we're just trying to refine it, getting it to a point where we're all on the same page and we can get that funding from the feds.
And I've just sort of been hearing that same answer for about a month. When do we expect that to be resolved and to you know, to come to a head one way or the other?
No, I appreciate that, sir. You know, in part, as we've probably shared with you and you've probably read, you know, the legislation was passed without any guidance. So the guidance continues to be released in, I don't know about dribs and drabs, but over time. So all localities and states are having to respond to the guidance as it becomes more refined.
Okay. Next question relates to contracts and purchases. I'm confident, and I've seen witness to the fact that, you know, that we're cutting back on some of our contracts. The big one, of course, was the police, you know, on-camera contract, which was a good significant cutback. I'm sure there's behind-the-scenes cutbacks, but I'm wondering, Mr. Bennett, if council could get a list. We'll never see the cutback because they won't come to us. I'm just wondering if council could get a list of like a quarterly list of something of things that we normally would be purchasing or contracting for that we're cutting back on. That's just my own request.
Yes, Councilman, this is John Bennett, Chief of Staff. Understood. And as we've transpired other memos, we can very easily let you know some of the efficiency moves that have occurred, especially in the FY20 next 5 months.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I only have two more quickies. Carol Post, I calculated that 38% of the fund for the One Tampa program comes either from the general fund reserves or from donations, very generous donations from the community. I think it was $2 million from reserves and $1 million plus from donations. And again, 3 weeks ago, I think myself, along with several other council members, we said, why not citywide? There are small businesses in every little corner of the city who are owned by folks who are working just as hard as they work in the CRA districts and then in the CDBG districts that are hurting just as much. It doesn't matter if they're in the business owner might live in Lutz, but if you know or whatever, but if their little business happens to be in South Tampa, then under phase one they got eliminated from consideration. I was hoping that under phase two that we might pick up that consideration. You know, I know that the county might be picking up some of that slack, and that's all fine and good, but I still don't understand the logic of why we as the city would be leaving behind those small businesses in those non-area, but I don't know what we want to call them, non-CRA, CDBG areas.
Councilman Dingfelder, I appreciate the question, and we did, in fact, look back at that. I think we feel like you do, that we really, in a best case scenario, do not want to leave any business behind, if that's how we're going to characterize it. When we looked at the data citywide, our concern was that, notwithstanding the very generous donations that have helped been contributed to for the One Tampa Fund and will help us achieve the goals that we're looking at as I've described. If we were to expand that citywide for the thousands and thousands and thousands of businesses that exist across the city, we felt like it may end up being too small of a relief amount for any business that qualified or that would really make a difference. And as I believe one of the other council members referenced, the idea of committing to this One Tampa relief, which its original intent was focused on the most vulnerable of our community that may not otherwise have access to other resources. So we felt like we should stay on path, stay committed to our original plan. And at the same time as we were digesting that, the federal funds that you referred to, the $250+ million was coming through. And I've joined John and Dennis and others in numerous discussions with the county, including a sort of a standing, ongoing planning meeting around how to best allocate and distribute those funds that would be countywide, and by that we mean geographically, so that those funds will flow to City of Tampa businesses. So we felt like that was in fact the point of One Tampa, was to bridge until other funds materialized, and in fact they did. They're tracking behind us, but we know that they're forthcoming. So I do appreciate it, and if we could have designed this in a way to help every business, that would be ideal. But I think we wanted to just stay true to the original intention and then turn our focus to that the countywide and CARES funds, and make sure that that gets directed accordingly to the city businesses that will be most benefited by it.
Well, as two lawyers, I'm going to give a quick rebuttal, but I think you can get around that issue. I think we have a fundamental fairness issue, and I won't restate it. I will restate it. A small business here is the same as a small business there. They're small businesses. They're all hurting. It doesn't matter what part of the city they're in. Number one. Number two is, to me, it's first come, first serve. If we get to a certain point when we used up the money, then we used up the money. But I think every small business in the city should be treated the same and fairly. I think we have a week to modify that and implement it. I think council stressed that 3 weeks ago, but she said there wasn't time, which was a reasonable explanation then. Now there's time to tweak it. All right, my last one is Mr. Bennett. And this goes really to the fundamental issue of the health of our county. It's hard to really understand and evaluate what's going on with the virus in the county and in the Bay Area, because testing increases, therefore the numbers increase of cases, et cetera. But Mr. Bennett, you're part of these discussions in a very broad way. I'd like to hear your take on the curve for our county in the Bay Area. To me, it looks like we've sort of flattened out, but we're not necessarily dropping. And my concern is now that everybody seems to be running around and acting somewhat normal and not wearing their mask, do we have great concern that curve's going to start going up again?
Thank you, Councilman Dinkfelder. John Bennett, Chief of Staff. I'll give a high-level response, and then I'll turn it over to Chief LaCicero, who is technically our unified or incident commander with the county over the state of local emergency in conjunction with the Department of Health. But generally speaking, we went into this with a concept of first, the mayor's edict was protect lives, and I think we did that good as a city, working with the county and of course in the region. Just as a point of reference, she sent me to other jurisdictions to make sure that our protection of lives plan, if you will, was as standardized as possible. So we gave the same levels of service in the city suggested to the county and the surrounding counties. And we feel like that worked really well because just about every day I'm in conversation with USF Public Health, Tampa General Hospital, other hospital providers our field testing centers. And of course, you see that through the daily situational reports, and you hear commentary every Monday and Thursday with the EPG for the county that includes the mayor. And to answer your question about the curve, the public health feedback that we get is that we have done extremely well. But as I stated in the beginning, as the mayor reminds us, is that we're at the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end at this point. So we have a journey to go. We've opened up every COVID situation report to City Council with a common theme of protecting lives, and now, of course, protecting livelihoods as we try and recover, and using the governor's guidance as it relates to our own backyard of density and risk factors. And I think you'll hear from the chief about what some of those are here in a second. But as we move along and work with these key partners and do these syndromic surveillances, which are multifaceted, coming in from just about every direction, our goal is, of course, to keep the curve as flat as possible, knowing that the county and the region as a whole has fared very well based on what we've seen around the country and in some cases around the state. A lot of that is due to taking that personal responsibility in the community after the guidance has come out from the mayor and other leaders to, like you said earlier, Councilman, to wear the mask and make sure that you're following those best practices as you reopen responsibly. And you have seen that with some of our reopening plans. As the percentage of occupancy increases from 25 to 50 to 75 and eventually 100%, we obviously we're going to have to make sure that we're looking at any hot spots in conjunction with the county and ensure that we're applying those resources, because when a generalized policy hits the county, we know that we have different data points of density. I call it the density by design, which is how dense we live, and then density by discretion, which is how we move around. And between those two data points, working with the schools of public health and even some of our business partners, we're monitoring that data closely, and I would welcome Chief LaCicero's feedback as well.
Chief, go ahead if you're on the phone. There you go.
Yes, good morning, Council. Council. The health department, our responders, partnerships of law enforcement, EMS, fire rescue, to ensure that we're all collectively doing the best practices and ensuring that we're taking the best measures appropriately. So it will change. We do have to make data decisions, and we're trying to grapple with the best things that we can. I will tell you that we're very, very akin to looking at the hospital data. We're doing a good job. We're not there yet at all. We're doing a good job with flattening the curve, but we keenly are aware of the stress on the healthcare system and making sure that the hospitals are not overwhelmed. And we continue to do a fairly good job with that. But it is about personal responsibility. It is about understanding that we're not out of this at all. And the protective measures, social distancing, all have to be kept up, and we have to lean forward into that. That's my summary. I'll take some questions if you have. Thank you.
Just a quick
follow-up question there.
Just a quick follow-up question, then I'm done. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Chairman and Council. In regard to assisted living facilities and nursing homes, my wife and I actually see this firsthand. We go to visit my mother in her assisted living. She'd been on lockdown for a couple of months, not for any personal bad behavior, but anyway, but when we go to see her, and it does concern me greatly about the healthcare workers who do come and go from that facility. I've heard that elsewhere in the country, Chief, that other places are testing those facility workers 2 or 3 times a week, which obviously seems obsessive, but I think it seems right. And I'm just wondering, are we looking at doing that as EPG, addressing that?
Yeah, yes, sir. That's a great question. And it was alluded to yesterday. Dr. Holt expanded upon that, but there is a process of testing not only the patients, but the staff that works there. The governor put out an executive order that really, if an individual works there, they can't refuse. We have to be allowed entry, and working through the state and the local health departments, they are testing and continue to test those workers and patients there to ensure their safety in compliance with all health rules.
So how often are they being tested now, and can we increase that at least on a citywide basis, if not county?
Well, it is. I said that broadly, but there is much focus on city facilities. There are more facilities in the county than there are in the city, but it includes city facilities. And what they've done an educational process, and they've done some initial testing, but I don't know the exact schedule on retest, but all of those facilities are called at least 2 times a week to follow up. They have already been tested once, but they are called 2 times a week, and they have multiple visits. And as to anything that raises up on some of the telephone discussions that they might have with the health department in the certain site, then they go in and they test again. So they are tested multiple times.
Okay, we'll talk more about that. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your patience.
All right,
Thanks
thank
for all
you
your
very much. Before I go to Chief John Bennett, I think the questions have been asked and the comments have been made. I appreciate everybody's input for this special call. I know that everybody's working very, very hard. The budget, of course, it's, we look back at the last 10 years, and it goes to the saying, just when we thought we were out, they pull us back in. Of course, that's Michael Corleone in Godfather 3. But this is a completely different situation. Just as we were getting back on our feet and doing well, we get hit with something that catches us completely off guard, and we see the projected losses. Hopefully they're not as bad as we saw today, but we just have to continue moving forward. I know we're doing the best we can, and I appreciate our budget department, our mayor, and everyone that's working hard on this. Having said that, Chief Bennett.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, thank you, Council, for taking the time out this morning for this important special session. One of the themes that I heard from Council through all of the Q&A part was a focus on our employees. And, we know that that's our greatest asset, and we especially appreciate the comments from all of you as it relates to our public safety personnel. I will tell you that in the monitoring that's been going on, you've heard us celebrate the name of Tiffany Klein out in our occupational health center that works for Chief LaCicero. And I can tell you that there's been over 10% of our public safety employees that have been in some sort of monitoring phase or at risk throughout the process as first responders, not to mention, of course, all the general employees. And I want to point out some things that you may or may not be aware of policy DUIs that have come through, where the mayor has adopted the presumption of public safety workers, should they come down with COVID, as being considered on the job, as well as all general employees who may have contracted COVID. If they do, that all co-pays and deductibles have been waived up to 30 days after our local state of emergency ends, which is still in effect. So it broadened those policies that relates to the healthcare specifically for the employees. The last couple things I want to point out is that we are fortunate to have an administration specifically led by the mayor who has gone through the Great Recession as a leader of the largest budget in the city, the police department, and of course the largest amount of personnel. We went through a Super Bowl planning session in the middle of the recession and did well. We came out of the recession planning the Republican National Convention, and we did all of that, and I felt that we did good as a city, not looking out just for an individual department, but the collective departments. And we're looking forward to being transparent with you through the budget planning cycle and the reporting memos, et cetera, that we've been trying to get to you iteratively while we're still working in the emergency. And my last comment relates to what we've all said about personal responsibility of the public. And I think if we had one request supported by council to the constituents would be one, please wear a mask wherever you go, because the studies have shown wearing a mask, not only for your own good, but of course, the protection of transmission, especially as it goes to our high-risk populations. Our youth may go out and do grocery shopping and things and then come home to an elderly or multi-generational family unit, and wearing a mask is a big preventative option there. Secondly, the social distancing, if you are going to entertain and go out and patronize our restaurants and the things that are starting to reopen, please practice the social distancing, which is again another great opportunity to keep the curve flat. And lastly, get tested. The numbers you may have heard from the EPG suggest that we test over 2,000 a day, 2,250 to be exact, based on the best practices. And those numbers are not only the field testing sites, but the private practitioners and our hospitals. So between all of them collectively, if we can hit those marks, we can keep that curve flat through testing and quarantining, and we could come out of this strong as we have done so far as a city, a county, and a region. And thank you, Chairman. That's it.
Thank you very much. That concludes the special call meeting. We'll be back 9 a.m. Thursday for another virtual meeting. I appreciate everyone taking part in this today, and we are adjourned. Thanks.